My friends, let us begin this hour by setting aside every notion you may have held about prayer, about God, and about the spiritual path, not because your ideas were wrong, but because today we approach a deeper revelation, one that cannot be grasped with the thinking mind, but must be felt as the living presence within. Prayer, as most of the world understands it, is an attempt to reach out toward a God who seems distant, a God who must be informed of our needs, convinced of our sincerity, persuaded to intervene in our affairs. But you and I are not here to persuade God. We are here to awaken to God, for prayer is not a reaching outward, it is a turning inward. It is the silent recognition that the very life which beats your heart is the same life that sustains the universe. And when you realize this, when you truly feel that God is not somewhere else but is the substance and essence of your own being, you will discover that prayer is not something you do, it is something you experience. You see, there is no such thing as unanswered prayer. There is only prayer offered from the wrong state of consciousness. As long as we pray from fear, from lack, from separation, we are like a branch trying to live apart from the vine. But the moment we rest quietly, without strain in the awareness of the one presence and the one power, then prayer becomes fulfillment. It becomes the revelation of what is already true. In our time together, we shall explore why so many prayers appear fruitless, and we shall learn why the great Master said, "It is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." The kingdom is not withheld. The kingdom is not delayed. It is we who have been looking in the wrong direction, outward, instead of inward, toward effects, instead of cause. Today we begin the sacred work of turning consciousness back to its source, and so I ask you to come with an open heart, not asking, not pleading, but listening quietly, receptively, to the still, small voice that whispers, "I am here." For prayer is the recognition of that presence, and the recognition of that presence is the beginning of every healing, every harmony, every demonstration of spiritual reality. This is the new way of seeing. This is the doorway to the kingdom. Now, let us look more closely at what happens when the human mind attempts to pray. I say attempts because the human mind cannot pray not truly. It can plead, it can fear, it can imagine, it can hope, but these are not forms of spiritual communion. These are the motions of separation consciousness, trying desperately to find its way back home. Most prayers on earth today are what I have called the bootless cry, a cry that has no spiritual foundation, no inner recognition, and therefore no power. It is the plea of someone who believes they stand outside the kingdom, knocking upon a door they think is closed, calling to a God they believe is somewhere else. And so they say, "God, come help me. God, take this burden. God, remove this evil. God, fix this situation." You can feel the strain, the fear, the urgency in such prayers. And yet, how can such a prayer reach God when it begins with the conviction that God is absent? The bootless cry comes from the belief that we are separated from the source of life. It comes from the belief that there are two powers at work in the world, one that harms and one that must rescue us. And because the prayer begins with that belief, the prayer itself reinforces the very illusion it wishes to overcome. Every time you beg God to save you from a problem, you are unknowingly giving reality to the problem. You are saying, "This difficulty has power. This condition has presence. This circumstance can act apart from God, and the moment you grant power to anything other than God, you step out of spiritual reality and into the dream of material sense. This is why the Master cautioned us against anxious, repetitive prayers, because anxiety is not prayer, repetition is not prayer, and fear is certainly not prayer. The human mind imagines that if it repeats a request loudly enough or long enough, it will somehow reach the heavens. But God is not reached through noise. God is realized through silence. God does not respond to fear, but God reveals himself in the stillness where fear dissolves. So long as you pray to get something, the prayer cannot rise. So long as you pray against something, the prayer cannot bear fruit. And so long as you pray as a separate self, the prayer cannot enter the kingdom. For the kingdom is not a place you approach. It is a state of consciousness you awaken to. The bootless cry is not wrong. It is simply immature. It is the cry of a child who has not yet discovered the presence within. But once you glimpse, even for a moment, that God is not a distant being, but the very life of your life, then prayer shifts from pleading to communion, from fear to recognition, from trying to reach God to realizing that God is already here. My friends, no one is judged for their human prayers, but we must outgrow them. We must rise into a form of prayer that begins with the assurance of God's nearness, with the certainty of God's wholeness, with a quiet confidence that there is only one presence and one power. Only then does prayer become the pathway to harmony. Only then does it become the doorway to the kingdom. Now, let us come to the very heart of why prayer fails, why peace seems distant, and why individuals who sincerely love God still find themselves troubled, afraid, or burdened. The issue is not that God withholds anything. The issue is not that your faith is inadequate. The issue is not that you must labor harder, pray longer, or speak more convincingly. No, the one great obstacle, the single barrier to spiritual fruitfulness, is the ancient belief in two powers. For thousands of years, mankind has believed that good and evil are two opposing forces, locked in eternal struggle. In this view, God is one power and disease is another. God is one power and lack is another. God is one power and human will, hatred, fear, or mortality stand against him. From this dualistic belief arises all suffering. From it arises the human craving to use prayer as a tool to persuade God to defeat an opposing force. And yet, my friends, how can a prayer rooted in duality ever attain the kingdom, which is the realm of oneness? Let me say this plainly. As plainly as the Spirit reveals it, there are not two powers. There is only one. God is not a power battling another power. God is the allness of existence. God is the substance and essence of reality itself. The moment we imagine a second power, no matter how small, we step out of the kingdom and into the illusion of separation. You see, the mind that cries out, God, please remove this evil, is the same mind that believes evil is something. But the moment you grant evil substance, presence, or power, you have denied the allness of God. You may not intend to do so, but as long as you hold the belief in two powers, you are praying with divided consciousness, and a divided consciousness cannot perceive the one. This error does not make you sinful. It makes you asleep. It binds you to the dream of material sense. It anchors you to a world in which events and conditions appear to exist independently of God, and therefore independently of harmony. And every spiritual teacher, every mystic, every master who has ever touched the infinite has spoken the same truth. The belief in two powers is the root of all bondage. Now consider how this applies to your daily life. When you fear a diagnosis, you are believing in two powers. When you resent another person, you are believing in two powers, one who can bless you and one who can harm you. When you worry about money, you are believing in two powers, God as abundance and something else as limitation. And each time your thought attaches itself to fear, grievance, or lack, you unknowingly affirm the presence of a second power. Then you pray. But your prayer rises no higher than the consciousness that produced it. This is why Jesus said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." And so, the spiritual journey is not a journey of acquiring metaphysical tools to fight your battles. It is the sacred work of dissolving the false belief that there is anything to fight at all. Evil is not a power, it is a misperception. Sin is not a power, it is a forgetting. Disease is not a power, it is the shadow cast when consciousness turns away from its source. The moment you recognize only one presence, only one power, the illusion loses its hold and harmony reveals itself. My friends, this is the foundation of all true prayer. If you can but grasp this, not intellectually, but spiritually, your entire life will shift. For in the presence of one, the dream of many dissolves, and what appears as healing, as restoration, as supply, is simply the unveiling of what has always been true, hidden only by the belief in two. Let us now turn our attention to the true nature of God, for unless we understand God aright, we cannot pray aright. And unless our understanding of God is purified of human concepts, our prayers remain confined to the realm of human belief. God is not what the world imagines him to be. God is not a magnified person, not a distant ruler, not a heavenly parent dispensing blessings one day and withholding them the next. God is not a being somewhere in the universe who must be summoned, pleased, or convinced. No, my friends. God is the very essence of being itself. God is life, not a giver of life, but life. God is love, not a dispenser of affection, but love itself. God is consciousness, not a mind among minds, but the infinite mind in which all true being lives, moves, and has its being. When we speak of one presence and one power, we are not speaking poetically. We are describing the literal nature of existence. God is omnipresence. There is no spot where God is not. God is omnipotence. There is no power opposed to God, no force capable of acting apart from God. And God is omniscience, the one mind, the one intelligence, eternally expressing itself as the harmony, order, and activity of the universe. Now, when you hear these truths, do not let them remain as abstract statements. Let them permeate your awareness until you feel, even faintly, their inner reality. For when you truly understand that God is infinite consciousness, you will see why prayer cannot be an attempt to change outer conditions. There are no outer conditions apart from consciousness. What the world calls conditions are merely forms, appearances, expressions of consciousness. To labor with the form is to miss the cause. To try to change the outer picture without changing the consciousness behind it is to chase shadows. And so prayer, true prayer, must take place within, where God dwells as your own consciousness. Not the personal mind with its fears and desires, but the deeper awareness in which the personal mind appears, you cannot bring God into your life, because God is already the life you are living. You cannot call God into a situation because there is no situation outside of the divine presence. What you can do is awaken to the reality that has always been here, but has been hidden behind the veil of material perception. God is not coming to you. God is not waiting for your call. God is not withholding himself until your prayer is acceptable. God simply is. And the moment your consciousness aligns with that isness, prayer becomes fruition. Not because God has changed, but because you have shifted from the dream of separation into the awareness of oneness. You see, the spiritual life is not the attempt to get God to join you in your human experience. It is the surrender of human experience to the divine awareness in which God alone is real. When you abide in this recognition, when you feel the stillness of the one presence, the sense of struggle dissolves, fear evaporates, the burden lifts, and what the world calls healing, supply, protection, or guidance unfolds naturally as the expression of harmony that was always present, waiting only for your recognition. This is why Jesus could say, "I can of mine own self do nothing." The personal self has no power, no light, no life, but the Christ consciousness, the awareness of one presence, reveals infinite capacity, infinite peace, infinite fulfillment. And so, when you turn within and rest in the understanding that there is one power, one presence, one consciousness, you begin to live in the kingdom here and now. As we move deeper into this subject of prayer, let us now set aside every concept of prayer that depends upon words, upon effort, upon repetition, or upon any attempt to influence God. For real prayer, spiritual prayer, is not something you recite, and it is not something you perform. Real prayer is the opening of consciousness to the awareness of what already is. It is the silent communion with reality, the inward beholding of the presence that never comes and never goes. To pray in the spiritual sense is not to ask for anything, but to listen. It is not to direct God, but to yield to God. It is not to declare what must be changed, but to recognize the changelessness of the one who is the very life of all that appears. True prayer begins in stillness, not speech. It begins with the recognition that there is nothing to be added to the fullness of God, and nothing to be taken away from the completeness of his presence. Most of the world comes to prayer with a problem to solve, but in spiritual understanding, prayer is not an attempt to solve problems. Prayer dissolves the belief in a problem, for a problem is nothing more than a mental picture formed in the absence of true seeing. When you bring spiritual awareness to the condition is seen for what it is, an appearance without substance or power of its own. This is why spiritual prayer is always silent, not silent merely in words, but silent in the inner agitation that tries to force reality to conform to personal desire. The human mind wants outcomes. The spiritual consciousness wants only truth. And so, in true prayer, you lay down your desires, your fears, your demands, your opinions, and you become receptive, utterly receptive to the movement of the divine within. This is what I have called spiritual listening. It is not listening for messages, not listening for signs, not listening for voices. It is listening for the felt sense of presence, the inner assurance that the one power is here. When you enter this state, no words are needed. The stillness itself is prayer. The silence itself is communion. And in that communion, the spiritual law of harmony begins to reveal itself. If, during prayer, your mind drifts toward the condition, toward fear, toward concern, toward what must be fixed, gently return to the awareness. God is the only presence here. Say it inwardly if you must, but say it not as an affirmation to force belief, but as a reminder of what is eternally true. Then rest in God's presence, as though you were floating upon an infinite sea of peace. No effort, no tension, no strain. When you cease trying to make prayer works. When you stop trying to use God to change the outer picture is illumined by the light of true consciousness. The moment you shift from asking to beholding, you enter the state in which harmony can unfold. This is why the Master so often withdrew to the silence, not to plead, not to recite, but to commune quietly, invisibly, with the source of all being. And when he returned to the world of appearances, the presence of God went before him, and whatever was unlike harmony fell away. So let your prayer be a resting, not a striving, a listening, not a speaking, a beholding, not a demanding. For the moment you enter into the silence of spiritual awareness, you discover the truth that makes all prayer effective. God is already here, and in his presence, all is well. Now that we have touched the essence of true prayer, let us gently examine what stands in the way of this realization. Not to condemn, not to judge, but to illumine. For whatever is brought to the light of spiritual awareness dissolves without struggle. The obstacles to prayer are never external. They are always habits of thought rooted in the belief that we are separate from the presence. When these habits are seen for what they are, they lose their seeming power. The first obstacle is anxiety, the restless attempt of the human mind to secure its own safety. When you come to prayer with fear, urgency, or a need to force results, the mind is too agitated to perceive the stillness of spirit. You may speak 1,000 words, but the silence in which God reveals himself is drowned by the noise of human worry. The Master said, "Take no thought," for he knew that spiritual vision cannot arise from a mind filled with concern for outcomes. To enter prayer, you must release the urgency, even if only for a moment, and step into the quiet recognition that the presence is already here. The second obstacle is grievance, the subtle or overt holding of another in condemnation. You cannot pray effectively while maintaining the belief that anyone has power apart from God. As long as you see someone as an offender, you are affirming a second power, and this blocks the awareness of oneness. True forgiveness does not mean excusing conduct. It means recognizing the spiritual identity behind the mask of human behavior. When you see another as God's own expression, even if their actions are not aligned with that reality, your consciousness is purified, and prayer becomes fruitful. A third obstacle is the desire for results. The personal mind wants prayer to produce an outcome. It imagines that if it prays correctly, God will act upon the world. But the world is not changed by prayer. Consciousness is revealed. When you pray for outcomes, for healing, supply, protection, you are unconsciously declaring that these things are absent and must be summoned. True prayer does not ask for a result. It seeks only the realization of the one presence. And when that presence is realized, the appearance of discord naturally dissolves, not because you forced it to change, but because the light made the darkness unreal. Another obstacle is mental noise, too much speaking, too much affirming, too much trying. Spiritual work is not done by the many words of the mind, but by the quiet surrender of the heart. The more you speak in prayer, the more you remain in the realm of the intellect. God does not respond to words. God reveals himself in silence. And so the most profound prayer is often without language, without thought, simply resting in the awareness that God is. Finally, one of the greatest obstacles is believing that prayer begins with you. Prayer does not begin when you decide to pray. Prayer begins when you become aware that the presence has already been praying within you. The initiative is not human reaching toward the divine, but divine love drawing the human consciousness upward into truth. You are not praying to bring God into your situation. You are praying to awaken to the God who is already present. Once you recognize these obstacles not as enemies to fight, but as shadows without substance, you will find that prayer becomes natural, effortless. You will slip more easily into that stillness in which the presence makes itself known. And in that awareness, harmony flows like a quiet river, touching every part of your experience with the assurance of divine order. Let us now consider what happens in consciousness when prayer rises above the human sense of life and enters the dimension Jesus called the kingdom of God. This shift is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with sensation or emotion. It is quiet, so quiet that unless you are attentive, you may overlook it. Yet it is the most profound transformation that can occur within an individual, for it marks the moment when you no longer seek God as something separate, but recognize God as the very life of your own being. Kingdom consciousness is not attained through effort. It is realized when effort ceases. It comes when you stop trying to reach God and begin to unfold into the presence that has been with you from the beginning. This shift is subtle, like a veil gently lifting. One moment you are looking at the world through the eyes of fear, lack, and duality. And the next moment, without quite knowing how, you sense that all is well, not that all will be well, not that God is about to fix something, but that in the presence of God, harmony already exists. This is the hallmark of kingdom consciousness, a deep, unshakable knowing that God is here, not as a concept, not as a belief, but as a felt reality. When this recognition dawns, even softly, fear begins to dissolve. Tension evaporates. The anxious drive to change outer circumstances fades away. You are lifted, not emotionally, but spiritually, into the awareness of one presence. In this state, you find that your relationship to problems changes instantly. You no longer see them as forces acting upon you. You see them as appearances without power. You do not deny the appearance, but you deny it authority. You behold it from a higher altitude, knowing that no condition can stand against the allness of God, and in that recognition, the appearance loses its hold, not because you fought it, but because you saw through it. This is why Jesus could walk into situations that terrified others and remain untouched. He lived from the kingdom, not from the world of effects. He saw through the outer picture into the spiritual essence behind it. And when you begin to live in this same awareness, even in small degree, you will find that you, too, carry a presence that changes the atmosphere around you. Now, how do we come into this shift? By turning within, again and again, until the habit of outward dependence gives way to inward recognition. Each time you are tempted to fear, you pause. Each time you are tempted to react, you become still. Each time you are tempted to look to people, circumstances, or resources for your good, you gently return to the truth. Only God is the source. Only God is the power. Only God is the presence. And as you practice this turning, something begins to happen. At first slowly, then more readily, your consciousness becomes attuned to the divine rhythm. You begin to feel a presence going before you. In all things, decisions become clear without strain. Peace remains even when appearances shift. You find yourself responding to life from a place of inner equilibrium rather than emotional reactivity. This is the kingdom expressing itself through you. Do not expect perfection. Do not expect to remain on the mountaintop every hour of the day. The spiritual life is not measured by how often you remain in the kingdom, but by how quickly you return when you drift. The return, that gentle turning within, that quiet recognition of one presence, is the essence of the path. And each return strengthens the awareness. Each return deepens the connection. Each return makes the kingdom more familiar, more accessible, until at last it becomes the atmosphere in which you live, move, and have your being. That, my friends, is the shift into kingdom consciousness, not the attainment of something new, but the unveiling of what has forever been true. Now, let us bring these principles from the realm of understanding into the realm of living, for truth must become embodied before it can bear fruit. Spiritual realization is not confined to the meditation chair. It is meant to flow through every circumstance of daily life, illuminating the ordinary moments with the light of the divine. And so, let us explore how the awareness of one presence expresses itself in health, in relationships, in supply, and in the countless small encounters that shape the rhythm of our days. Consider first the matter of health, for this is where many seek answers. In the human view, a physical condition seems to possess power to harm, power to frighten, power to dictate the body's destiny. But from the standpoint of spiritual consciousness, disease has no inherent power. It is not a force opposed to God. It is an appearance formed in the mind that believes in two powers. When you look at a condition with fear, you lend it the authority it appears to have. But when you behold it from the recognition that God is the only life, the only law, the only presence expressing as the body, the fear dissolves, and the condition loses its seeming reality. The healing is not a battle won, but a misperception corrected. Now let us turn to relationships. How often do we suffer because we look upon another as a separate, flawed, resistant, or harmful personality? Yet, each time you see someone through the lens of personal sense, you step into duality. The moment you replace judgment with a recognition of spiritual identity, the harmony begins its quiet work. You need not speak a word, you need not reason with them, correct them, or persuade them. Simply behold them as God's own expression, struggling perhaps to awaken, but divine at their core. This silent recognition has more power to transform relationships than any words you could utter, for it shifts the consciousness in which the relationship exists. Now consider supply. The world teaches that supply comes from people, from employment, from opportunities, from conditions, and so human beings live in anxiety, fearing that the channel may dry up, but supply does not come from channels. Supply comes from the source, an infinite source that is not dependent on circumstance. When you believe that your security is tied to a particular job, a particular person, a particular economy, you are believing in two powers, God and something else. But the moment you realize that God within you is the source and substance of all true supply, the fear of lack is dissolved. Then supply appears in forms appropriate to your need, not because you prayed for things, but because you recognize the presence that is the substance of all things. And what of the smaller moments, the irritations, the conflicts, the unexpected disruptions that arise in daily life. These are the greatest opportunities for spiritual practice. When a situation triggers annoyance or fear, do not rush to correct the outer picture. Instead, pause. Just a moment, turn within, recognize only one presence is here. Do not attempt to change the person or the circumstance. Simply return to the awareness of the presence. You will find that your response changes, your perception changes, and often the situation itself softens. Without your intervention, this is the power of non-resistance, the power of seeing through appearance into reality. Let me offer you a simple practice, one you may use throughout your day, especially in moments of tension or confusion. Pause for just a breath and rest inwardly in the truth. One presence, one power, one life. Say it gently, not as a command or a mantra, but as a recognition. Feel its significance. Let it settle into your awareness. This single moment of turning within, repeated throughout the day, will gradually lift your consciousness until the presence becomes the atmosphere in which you dwell. And as you live this way, you will begin to notice something subtle but unmistakable. The world responds differently to you. People speak to you differently. Problems resolve with less effort. Guidance comes without struggle. Opportunities appear without striving. This is not magic. It is the natural result of living from the kingdom within. You see, when consciousness is illumined, life harmonizes, not because you made it so, but because the realized presence expresses as the very pattern of your experience. And this, my friends, is the practical demonstration of spiritual truth. As we bring this hour to its close, let us not think of it as an ending, but as a beginning of a deeper walk, a more illumined awareness, a more constant abiding in the kingdom that has always been within you. Nothing I have said to you today is meant to be taken as philosophy or as theory. It is not a doctrine to memorize, nor a technique to master. It is an invitation to awaken to the truth that your life, here and now, is lived in God, and that God is lived in you. The great mistake of the human experience is the belief that we must travel a long way to reach God, or that we must become something other than what we are. But the kingdom is not attained through effort. The kingdom is revealed through recognition. The presence you seek is the very essence of your own being, and every time you turn within, every time you rest in the quiet awareness of one presence, every time you choose truth over appearance, you step deeper into that kingdom. Do not expect that you will always remain on the mountaintop. The fluctuations of human experience may still appear. Old habits of thought may still arise. But the spiritual life is not measured by how seldom you fall. It is measured by how quickly you return. Each return strengthens the awareness. Each return deepens the realization. Each return brings you nearer to the effortless state in which the presence becomes the natural atmosphere of your consciousness. Live gently with yourself. Live gently with the world. Do not demand perfection of mind or body. Simply cultivate the habit of turning toward reality instead of appearance. When faced with fear, return to the presence. When provoked by another, return to the presence. When confronted by lack, return to the presence. When the mind grows busy or weary, return to the presence. Let this become your practice, not a strenuous discipline, but a quiet inclination of the heart. And as this inner turning becomes your way of life, you will find that your prayer changes without your effort. It becomes less a plea and more a realization, less a request and more a recognition, less an attempt to reach God and more an experience of God reaching through you. And in that state, all things necessary for your path will come in their own right way, in their own right time, as the natural expression of divine harmony. Remember always, you are not seeking God. God is expressing as you. You are not a human trying to reach the divine. You are divine consciousness appearing in human form. And the moment you recognize this truth, even in the smallest degree, the peace of the kingdom rises within you like a quiet dawn, illuminating your path, guiding your steps, and enfolding your life in a presence that has no opposite. Carry this awareness with you as you return to the activities of the day. Let your life be a prayer, not the prayer of words, but the prayer of recognition. Walk gently, speak softly, behold the Christ in every face, and allow the presence to live itself through you, for in that realization lies the fullness of the kingdom, here and now. And so we close, not with a request, but with a quiet knowing God is the only presence, God is the only power, God is the life we are living, and all is well.